Chapter 8. The Point of Consciousness and the Technique of Therapeutic Suggestion. The nature of the self, the center of consciousness, embellishment and adornment attitudes toward health problems, skill as a form of self-control, singing with the mind, sudden and dramatic compulsions, the negative emotion of fear, hate, the irrational emotion, the 7 types of love, religious fixation, intelligence and intellect, movements of the point of mental attention, the destructiveness of worry, demoralizing remorse, selfishness and egotism and selfishness, the divinity complex, the need for directions, 10 commandments for right-handed living, the nature of the self. Very few Westerners have studied Buddhist biophysics. This is because for most Westerners, Buddhism is a religion, and they don't consider the philosophical and scientific aspects of the doctrine. However, Buddhism is one of the few great systems of spiritual culture that in no way conflicts with the growing body of knowledge encompassed by the broad fields of physics, biology, and astronomy. We must not fall into the error of assuming that ancient India had no knowledge of the physical sciences. Asia is an unsuspected source of invaluable scientific information that is now in general circulation, usually attributed to the Greeks or Egyptians. Buddhism has a significant teaching about the nature of the ego. In the Eastern system, the word sattva represents the center of consciousness, the point of I or selfhood. For the ancient Buddhists, the sattva wasn't an entity or permanent being, but rather a complex of attention. This could shift from one part of the body to another, or change its quality or condition to a different one through the impulse of the will. Sattva is always in motion, its physical movement is according to its location, and its spiritual movement is according to its state. Although all of this sounds very abstract, it only takes a little thought to realize the practical implications of the idea. Individual consciousness is constantly changing. Beliefs that were held with fanatical devotion yesterday are of little interest today, because the point of view has changed. A viewpoint is a place in matter or mind from which we see some external object or opinion. Our viewpoint depends on where we are or what we are. The instant either of these conditions changes, our perspective changes accordingly. We may gain new information about the object of our attention, then, in light of this additional knowledge, our viewpoint changes and the appearance of the object itself is altered. If our center of consciousness, for some internal or external reason, moves away from a certain thing, that thing ceases to exist as a force in our lives. On the other hand, if consciousness focuses on some factor, without prior interest, suddenly we discovered the vitality in this new object of our attention becomes an important element in the pattern of our convictions. A discovery can be finding something previously hidden or unknown, or the internal perception of something previously unaware. In the latter case, discovery is an adventure of attention. In our daily lives, we are constantly exploring distances of mental or physical dimension in search of a solution to our current doubts. The center of consciousness. How do we define the center of consciousness? We must realize that human beings have many perceptions and faculties, each of which registers a fragment of sensory experience. While these mental powers are more or less alert all the time, there can be no clear picture of the things they register unless several faculties focus on a single point and provide a composite testimony. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had his hero, Sherlock Holmes, remind Dr. Watson that he had climbed the Baker Street steps almost every day for years, but had never been conscious enough of the ascent to know the number of steps. If several mental faculties concentrate on a given object, the mind becomes definitively aware of the reality and substance of that object. When these mental rays meet, they form a powerful focus. Sattva. This flow, in the willpower of attention, takes its place in this field of intensity and operates from there, as long as attention remains focused there. Attention is the will to perceive. and consciousness always moves with the will. This is how we come to understand the nature of sattva. This is one of the deepest mysteries of Buddhist philosophy. The center of consciousness lies at the center of the converging rays of the faculties of attention, and wherever the point of attention is at any given moment, the them, it's there. Although the sattva it is in constant motion, we can say that the point of consciousness is postulated in that division of the personality where it remains most of the time. This postulation of sattva, this is the key to the dominant temperament. If the focus is on the physical nature, the individual is a materialist. If the focus is on the lower emotional nature, they are an emotionalist. If the focus is on the higher emotional nature, they are an aesthete. If the focus is on the lower mental nature, they are an intellectual. If the focus is on the higher mental nature, they are a philosopher. And if the focus is on the spiritual nature, they are a mystic or occultist. Beautification and adornment. When our focus of consciousness is on the physical realm, we become highly aware of the body, its appearance, health, and comfort, and the circumstances that affect it. We live, feel, and think in terms of the body, and our actions are motivated by physical considerations. Among the consequences of focusing attention on the physical body are the primal impulses toward beautification and adornment. The ancient Chinese, Hindus, and Greeks, both men and women, used cosmetics and perfumes extensively. Ladies of the Egyptian dynasties wore nail polish on their toenails and fingernails and carried powders, rouge, and lipstick when they traveled. Some tribes in Central Africa still consider rancid butter a fragrant hair oil, and Rajput gentlemen who wish to be fashionable dye their beards. Human beings, always desiring to be physically attractive to others of their kind, have devised a variety of ways to enhance their natural charms. Adornment began with the use of bones, feathers, flowers, and furs. Later, ornaments were carved from colored stones, molded from clay, and hammered or cast into metals. Clothing was originally designed for protection or adornment, not for concealment. It was also used to cover bodily defects, but the motive was more aesthetic than moral. Only in the last 2,000 years has clothing become associated with morality, with the curious result that immorality has generally increased among clothed nations. This has been due to the constant emphasis on concealing the body, which has focused the attention of the conscience on the moral issue. While attention to personal appearance and good taste are indicators of refinement, an obsession with it can lead to an exaggerated form of vanity. If an individual is solely concerned with appearance, they may come to substitute outward adornment for inner fulfillment. When Alcibiades, who was wealthy and rich, appeared before Plato in exceptionally extravagant attire, the philosopher remarked quietly, "What a pity a lead dagger has such a fine sheath." Attitudes towards health problems. The focus of attention can be drawn to the physical realm due to pain or other bodily distress. Certain illnesses, especially those affecting the heart, draw consciousness to their symptoms with an almost hypnotic power. When a physician takes the pulse of a healthy person, even this simple action, by directing consciousness, causes an increase in heart rate. Among patients with heart disorders, there is a strong tendency to become pulse takers. The anxious patient will take their own pulse every hour and feel as if they are having a relapse whenever they notice the slightest irregularity. Another group has a fixation on symptoms, which quickly degenerates into hypochondria. Others cling to the foolish belief that certain pain is out of danger and self-medicate with painkillers. It is well known that patients suffering from incurable diseases generally have a more sensible attitude toward their condition than those whose health problems are trivial. The reason is that hopelessness frees the mind from uncertainty. The physical fixation relaxes because there is no possible cure. The mind resolves to make the best use of the remaining time. Deformities and peculiarities of physical appearance intensify body awareness, resulting in an inferiority complex and excessive self-consciousness. When these can be corrected through cosmetic surgery, a general improvement in the psychological pattern of life almost always follows. If the physical condition cannot be improved, the individual can be taught that it is still possible to have a useful and successful life if they overcome self-pity and negative thinking. Aesop, the immortal writer of fables, was a slave and a hunchback. Socrates had bowed legs and a pigeon-like chest, and the great poet Milton was blind. Helen Keller, blind and mute, has one of the most radiant personalities I have ever had the privilege of knowing. Physical disabilities impede success only when consciousness is so firmly focused on them that all other considerations are denied. It is also likely that an athlete may become a victim of their own physical perfection and forget that the body is the mortal vehicle of an immortal soul. A Greek sophist was once invited to attend the public games held in Athens so that he might see a famous local gymnast who could swim like a fish, run like a deer, and had the strength of a bear. The scholar gratefully declined, but added that he would be delighted to be a spectator if there were a human being among the participants who could think like a human being. Skill as a form of self-control. In most arts, sciences, and crafts, skill is necessary for competence. The hands, and sometimes the entire body, must be trained to fulfill the impulses of the mind. What then is skill? In the popular mind, skill is a technical ability developed or acquired through patience, perseverance, or specialized training. According to this view, the body is trained to perform certain actions, much like we might train a seal for the circus. Philosophically speaking, skill is achieved through three processes. First, the mind must be fully informed about the laws and principles governing the matter under consideration. Second, the patterns of the desired physical effects and the bodily processes necessary to achieve them must be clearly visualized in the mind. And third, the body itself must be disciplined to respond immediately to the impulse of the will. Skill is a form of self-control, and one of the reasons why it is so difficult to acquire a particular technique is that the average person's body has generally never been subjected to will control. If the center of consciousness is focused on the bodily mechanics of an art, the result can be serious technical fixation. In music, the most skilled technician is rarely the greatest genius, despite what public opinion may suggest. The musician who allows the means to dominate the end, regardless of virtuosity, will remain mediocre. In painting, drawing, and sculpture, this is also true. The most adept draftsman can be the most mediocre artist because he lacks imagination and creative power. A dancer is merely a gymnast unless muscular control is guided by imagination and the aesthetic realization of rhythm and design. Leonardo da Vinci's immortal painting, the Mona Lisa, is priceless, but a perfect reproduction made by a skilled copyist is worth only a few dollars. The true value of a painting lies in its spiritual content, in the vision that conceived it, in the intangible nuances that permeate it. Proper technique is important, but the truth is that without inspiration, skill is lifeless. The world's greatest artists have produced poor paintings when the subject matter failed to inspire them. And mediocre artists have created great works under the inspiration of a captivating spiritual or emotional impulse. Art is an impulse that moves through the body, and its full expression depends on the relaxation of the physical structure. Wherever there is body awareness, there will be body tension, and where there is body tension, the flow of the impulse is blocked. Singing with the mind. The Chinese had already mastered the fine arts when Europeans were still living in caves and fighting bears with stone axes. To Easterners, our Western singing is a loud noise full of holes. They don't understand how anyone can enjoy an intellectual performance of memorized compositions, executed with muscular effort. The holes occur when the vocalist has to pause to take a deep breath before attempting the note C. Singing technique is typical of the artistic method. If the voice student is fortunate enough to have an intelligent teacher, they will learn that the tone is formed in the mind, not in the throat. We sing with the mind, through the body. The tone flows from the tonal center of consciousness as a vibration. It is brought to the surface of the will, sustained but never forced by willpower. The vocal cords transform the mental tone into physical sound. The will controls the tone through the physical medium of breath. Breathing does not create tone as a physical vessel, it merely carries the tone of the transformed mental impulse. Singing is a spiritual experience, not simply a physical technique. Always remembering that tension destroys tonal quality, the enlightened singer keeps their focus of awareness away from all the physical structures involved in producing tones. If the vocalist becomes aware of their breathing, they will try to force the pitch by increasing their breath, or the focus will cause tension that leads to shortness of breath. If they think about their throat, the singer will interfere with the natural leveling. The tone will become guttural, and the tension will cause dryness and even irritation. Mouth awareness will cause tension in the facial muscles, cramps, and result in unpleasant grimaces and those noticeable lip contortions so common in poorly trained singers. The rule is, relax and sing, or tense up and grunt. A simple formula for overcoming the structural and functional fixations that hinder vocal processes is to place the center of awareness in the magnetic field outside the physical body, about 12 inches in front of the mouth. Since the magnetic field is an extension of the body, the point of attention can be placed in the aura as easily as in the physical structure. In a curious extra-dimensional way, this placement of the center of attention allows for the complete formation of the tone before it reaches consciousness. By deliberately placing the thought in a specific location, attention is focused there, and the body is free to perform its functions without conscious interruption. This isn't actually singing outside the body, but rather focusing awareness far enough away from the delicate mechanism of tone production so that it doesn't interfere with natural processes. Thus, to increase volume, the singer doesn't force the pitch with their breath, but instead shifts their center of awareness away from the body and allows the pitch to flow to that point. Become aware of the person sitting in the back row, the rule goes, and the pitch will reach them at the right volume, and without the distortion that results from forcing it. A well-trained singer never tries to sing through the flu, they sing over, beyond, and away from the congestion, keeping their focus of awareness outside the body. The same technique would apply if a public speaker developed laryngitis. It is possible to overcome many of the body's limitations by shifting the point of awareness, by relaxing tense nerves and muscles. Sudden and dramatic compulses. Many functional disorders result from unhealthy fixation supported by real or imagined symptoms. Several cases have been recorded of completely paralyzed individuals who have recovered as a result of a sudden and dramatic compulsion. A woman confined to her wheelchair jumped out and ran 100 yards to save a baby who had crawled to the edge of a swimming pool. The mother's attention was so intensely focused on her child's danger that she completely forgot her own condition. Her body obeyed her without question, driven by the will to reach the endangered baby. The Chinese have a story, probably a legend, about an old scholar whose habit was to walk along the shore of a small lake while meditating on the spiritual mystery of the Tao. One day, in deep contemplation, his attention became focused on his mystical speculations, and he entered the lake, walking confidently on the water. A moment later, he suddenly realized where he was and was overcome with fear. He immediately sank and nearly drowned. The story of the disciple who went out to the Sea of Tiberias to meet the Master has a similar meaning. As long as he kept his attention on Jesus, he was safe, but the moment his mind returned to focusing on himself, he became afraid, and the power of such a phenomenon departed from him. A man who had been shipwrecked on a small uninhabited island with his newborn son realized that, without proper nourishment, the child would die in his arms. The baby clung to him, crying, and so great was the father's love and desire to feed him that milk formed in his mammary glands, and he was able to nurse his son until they were rescued several weeks later. In cases like this, we realize the power of consciousness over the body and how completely the physical structure can respond to the purposes of the will. When the human center of consciousness focuses on the emotional nature, feeling and desire dominate the individual's awareness. Fear, hatred, and love are the most intense emotions, and if they are allowed to control thought and action, physical complications can naturally arise. Feelings are the most difficult impulses to moderate, but unless their extremes are tempered by a reasonable amount of self-control, the body's health will certainly suffer. The negative emotion of fear. Fear is the basic negative emotion. It is the source and substance of countless painful anxieties. Among the most common aspects of fear are dread, fright, alarm, discouragement, dismay, panic, terror, and horror. The habit of fearing is easily acquired, and once established, it is extremely difficult to overcome. Fear is an irrational emotion, co-eternal with humankind's animal life, and must be included among the afflictions for which there is still no cure. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is having conviction even in the presence of fear. Any action, circumstance, condition, object, or substance can cause worry, anxiety, or seem terrifying to those with a fearful mind. It's normal to consider the unknown as potentially threatening. We fear most what we understand least. Of course, human survival is threatened by numerous natural and man-made hazards, and those who suffer from a general tendency toward phobias magnify these risks and ignore more optimistic probabilities. One of the most debilitating types of fear is the morbid anticipation of disaster. The victim becomes so drained by their own premonitions that they have little strength left to face a crisis should one occur. In addition to simple fears, a large number of curious phobias have been observed and classified. One group includes claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, anginophobia, fear of narrow spaces, and agoraphobia, fear of open spaces. Another interesting category includes graphophobia, fear of writing, logophobia, fear of words, and ideophobia, fear of ideas. Then there is belonophobia, fear of needles, and isoptrophobia, fear of mirrors. If you have siderodromophobia, you are afraid of trains, and if you have ergophobia, you suffer from the most fashionable affliction, fear of work. A great many fixations on fear originate in childhood, that period being particularly sensitive to impressions. I have been struck by several cases in which ordinary men and women have suffered extreme mental anguish during their adult years, as a result of childhood fear of obedience, caused by ignorant nurses or parents. Religious denominations that promulgate doctrines of sin, hell, and the devil have also contributed greatly to the emotional demoralization of children. A fully developed phobia is an irrational and uncontrollable terror of a particular subject or object. The victim experiences intense panic and suffers indescribable torment without knowing why, and usually with a clear mental understanding of the absurdity of their condition. Many phobias originate from the natural human tendency to rely on false generalizations about a particular circumstance. A man was bitten by a dog, and as a result, he became afraid of dogs, assuming that all the dogs are like the one who bit him. Or, to cite another example, a sensitive and naturally fearful child was locked in a dark closet as punishment. 20 years later, that child, now an adult, asks his wife to bring him his shoes because he can't go to his own bedroom closet without becoming emotionally upset. There is a silver lining to the problem of phobias. They generally dissolve with positive action. The quickest and surest way to overcome a fear fixation is to perform the action you fear. The man who was afraid of dogs recovered when he adopted several dogs, and they became his regular companions. The first week he felt very uncomfortable, but as the months passed, he came to love his pets. The husband who was afraid of closets required a more extensive treatment program. He had a weak heart, and if he had been abruptly locked in a dark closet for several hours, he might have died of sheer terror. After considerable conditioning, he was induced to enter the closet for a few seconds, with the door open. Gradually, his courage increased, and he was able to stay for several minutes without serious discomfort. Then, over a period of weeks, the door was kept closed for successively longer periods. Until one day, with a kind of tragic courage, he walked up to the closet, like a condemned man entering a death cell, closed the door, and stood there for half an hour. He left calm and serene, with a look of triumph in his eyes. All he said was, "I am no longer afraid," but this says a lot to those who have suffered for so long from strange fears, who know what it really means to break one of these fixations. Another irrational emotion is hatred, defined as an intense form of aversion. It is far more dangerous for the person who hates than for the object of the hatred. Hate, the irrational emotion. No one can hate and be healthy at the same time. It is human nature to dislike those who have hurt them, stolen their worldly possessions, or thwarted their goals. The other person may be largely to blame, but the one who hates, no matter how justified the cause, bears the greatest responsibility. The biblical counsel to do good to those who use us despite everything is not only a noble statement of spiritual truth, but also a fundamental principle of psychotherapy. I have observed that most people regard their hatreds as justifiable emotions, and they have no particular desire to overcome them. They seem to feel that through their hatred, they achieve some kind of indirect revenge. Overcoming an implacable hatred can require many years of reflection on real or imagined afflictions, so that when it is achieved, it is not unusual to learn that the hated person had already died long ago. The ancient custom of forgiving the dead and burying all grievances with the body was not so much a kindness to the deceased as a release for the living. The energy spent perpetuating grudges is not available for positive achievements, and those who hate are impoverished by their destructive emotions. A philosophical attitude toward life and people is a good remedy for fixations of hatred. An old doctor, who had spent 60 years studying human nature in all its complex manifestations, once told me, "I am completely convinced, based on a lifetime of experience and observation, that every man does the best he can, with what he is and what he knows." The psychology student becomes tolerant of people and their flaws. They realize that, driven by similar motivations and limited by the same training, circumstances, and traditions, they would likely make the same mistakes that seem so despicable in others. No man is hurt so much by what is done to him as by his own mental and emotional reactions to offenses. On one occasion, the Greek philosopher Diogenes was grievously insulted by an ignorant soldier who publicly spat in his face. The great skeptic remained silent for a moment and then said with a smile, "I realize that I should be angry at this unjustified act, but my addiction to wisdom and love of humanity have taken away my temper. and I don't know how to get angry. Hatred is a destructive fixation on the center of attention. If the fixation is too intense and the individual cannot overcome it through willpower alone, suggestion therapy is suggested. In extreme cases, hypnotherapy is helpful. There are times when the hated person has become the patient's best friend. Once the complex has been broken, it is possible to hate anyone if one only sees their flaws, and conversely, it is equally possible to like someone after becoming aware of their virtues. Particularly difficult aversion complexes can result from marital incompatibility endured over a long period. Minor irritations, lovingly tolerated, fester into hatred and even loathing. It is a tragic mistake to allow human relationships to degenerate into domestic chaos. The wisest course is for the couple to acknowledge the failure, end the marriage, and separate amicably. Even if they have children, separation may be the best path forward. Disharmony in the home will damage the child's psyche and perpetuate the parents' complexes in the next generation. The 7 types of love. Love is the most mysterious of human emotions. According to Platonist teachings, there are 7 types of love: the love between man and woman, the love between parents and children, the love between friends, the love of beauty, the love of goodness, the love of wisdom, and the love of God. In this sequence, there is a gradual ascent of the emotional focus from the personal, through the impersonal, to the spiritual. All physical aspects of love involve a strong personal attachment to the object of affection, and this attachment easily intensifies to the point of becoming an obsession. The emotion of possession is also stimulated, and is frequently mistaken for affection. The desire to possess or be possessed is present in most forms of human affection, and its absence is considered abnormal. The trend in modern psychology is to rationalize emotional processes and seek natural explanations for attachments and dislikes. A considerable amount of evidence has accumulated to show that love results from subconscious impulses originating in personality patterns. One's loving nature is formed in childhood and rarely changes in later years. If the parents' home has been reasonably harmonious, children will fall in love with people who remind them of their parents in appearance or temperament. Boys will choose wives who resemble their mothers, and girls will choose husbands who resemble their fathers. If the childhood home was unhappy, or the parents die, or the children are raised by other relatives, then the dominant personalities in the children's lives will be the types with whom they later have an affinity. A daughter born to an elderly but pleasantly friendly father might have no interest in boys her own age, and could marry a man 25 years her senior and be perfectly happy. A boy who adored his disabled sister married a charming but physically frail woman and is intensely happy catering to her comforts. In cases like these, there are indications that we prefer to continue throughout life with the familiar patterns that were pleasant in our childhood. Unfortunately, we can be disappointed, for we can fall in love with a similarity only to discover that no 2 people are alike, and similarity is an illusion when we have to live with differences. Extreme possessiveness is the most disastrous consequence of vehement attachment. It is almost impossible to feel possessive without the impulse to dominate. There are no happy endings to situations created by domination. If, for example, a strong-willed parent fails to dominate a child, the parent laments. But if domination is achieved, the child's life is ruined. Possessive parents are a serious threat to their children's future. Widowed mothers can become transgressive, especially if they have only one child. If the child is a boy, he will be in serious danger of becoming homosexual, and if it is a girl, she could remain single, and her entire personal life will become a pointless sacrifice for the well-being and happiness of a selfish mother. In practice, there's a fine line where possessiveness ceases to be a charming and touching form of loving flattery and becomes a nasty and destructive kind of tyranny. The younger generation is too independent-minded to tolerate such a state of affairs, but several of these cases have caught my attention as involving people well into middle age. A 55-year-old woman, suffering from a variety of frustrations and deeply neurotic, suspected that the cause of her unhappiness was a domineering husband. In their 32 years of marriage, he had never allowed her to choose her own clothes, leave the house without him, have close friends, visit her family, or express a personal like or dislike. She was not allowed to learn to drive, was not given money, could not vote according to the dictates of her own conscience, attend the church in which she had been raised, nor could she have any say in the upbringing of their children. The only opportunity she had to come to me was when her charming husband was in the hospital with a well-deserved gallbladder ailment. Of course, this is an extreme case, but a similar situation exists to some degree in many homes. Buddha pointed out 25 centuries ago that possessiveness is the root cause of suffering. The dictionary defines suffering as pain or sadness arising from loss or disappointment. Loss is impossible without a sense of possession, and disappointment can be the loss or failure of something expected. The loss of material possessions results in poverty, and the loss of people results in loneliness, which is poverty of companionship. It is a sad but common mistake to become so completely involved with others, since losing these people destroys the reason and purpose of our own existence. Realizing how dependent we have become on those we love, our natural instinct is to cling to them no matter the cost. When, as must happen, they finally leave us, our suffering is uncontrollable, and there is nothing left but to live with our memories. The only solution to this problem is to build a personal existence that can survive the loss of people and external things. It is not to be expected that the emotional life of the average person will be completely satisfactory. However, any serious deviation from humanity's normal patterns leads to tragic consequences. Nature has ordained that men and women establish homes, bring children into the world, prepare them for life according to their abilities and circumstances, and then release, so that they can establish their own lives. Stepping outside this simple cosmic scheme of things, regardless of the reasons, increases the risks in living and opens oneself up to dangerous complexes, fixations, frustrations, and neuroses. When emotional life has been thwarted, the inhibited person typically turns to religion or seeks relief through the fulfillment of ambitions. The individual might fall into some strange cult, participate in philanthropic endeavors, join a club dedicated to high criticism, or suddenly become aware of civic mismanagement. The process by which the neurotic becomes spiritual is briefly summarized in a statement made to me some years ago by a prominent member of a metaphysical sect. "My husband divorced me," she moaned. "Then I lost my money in a bad investment, all my children left me, I have poor health, and since I have nothing to live for, I gave myself to God." It hadn't occurred to this woman that she would be no more valuable to the deity than she had been to the members of her own family. Religious fixation. Many psychologists consider religion to be as dangerous an obsession as acute alcoholism or chronic drug addiction. While not necessarily agreeing with this opinion, it is worthwhile to understand why mental health professionals reach such a conclusion. Their sound argument is essentially as follows. Most who take refuge in religion are fleeing situations they lack the courage to face. The balm in Gilead is merely a balm for their wounded egos. As escapists, they should gain inspiration only to return to the world, confront their problems, resolve them, and restore their self-confidence and stability. While snuggling in the Lord's arms, these unfortunate but well-intentioned people are simply exchanging whims for ineptitude. the current state of many religious movements fully justifies the psychologist's viewpoint, and the facts he has gathered cannot be overturned by sentimental opposition or the howls of heresy. The error lies with modern religions, especially those of the West, which have divorced themselves from the great systems of spiritual philosophy that formed the foundation of their faiths. Julian the Apostate, the noblest of the Roman emperors, attacked the early church for this very error and turned to the gods of his fathers. The essence of Julian's discourse against the Christians can be summarized in a few lines. No one is worthy to enter a place of worship unless their mind is devoted to learning, their heart to virtuous emotions, and their body to good works. God does not rejoice in sinners, but in the righteous, not in fools, but in the wise, not in the well-intentioned, but in those who do good. Only when men put their own lives in order is it appropriate for them to approach the house of God. The temple is defamed. When people come only to ask for favors, the devout should come to give thanks for the beauty of the world and the universal good that governs all created things, intelligence and intellect. When the center of consciousness focuses on the mental nature of human beings, thought dominates both emotion and action. To understand the dominance of thought, we need to define intelligence and intellect. The popular conception is that intelligence is the intellect in action. It seems to me that the two words signify entirely different states of mind. Intelligence is the power to perceive the nature of the external world in relation to ourselves. It is the ability to discern the interrelationships of presented facts and how they affect us. And it is the aptitude to face unexpected situations through appropriate personality adjustments. Intelligence arises from experience and observation, and is sometimes present to a remarkable degree among those who have not benefited from formal education. There is little evidence that schooling can bestow intelligence. In fact, school training is likely detrimental to basic intelligence. Intellect, for me, is intelligence that has been shaped by formal education. An intellectual person is someone who has acquired various forms of knowledge and uses this knowledge, rather than innate intelligence, to solve problems. Since much of so-called knowledge is merely established opinion with little basis in fact, the intellectual can be overly adept at fallacies. An educated person is more likely to entangle their life in destructive complications. They lack the ability, so evident among primitive people, to think simply and directly. Artificial values divert their attention, and their conclusions lose their call to action. It is unfortunate that we must unlearn so much of what we have been taught as truth before we can put our lives in order. The intellectual, limited by their knowledge, is helpless in the face of the unknown. The intelligent person, because they have not been constrained by formal training, applies common sense to complex problems and usually finds a solution. One of the most common tricks of the intellectualist is to substitute words for ideas. They will argue with words instead of thoughts, then consider themselves victorious if they outmaneuver their opponent. Although it was the medieval scholastics who discovered that using long words in a foreign language is an excellent way to hide ignorance, nowadays when an educated man calls a dandelion Taraxacum officinale, we can assume that he has a deep knowledge of the plant. It is good to know that names can be memorized without any particular benefit, but thoughts must arise from the diligent and intelligent study of the facts. The intellectual has a type of mind that can easily deteriorate and become fertile ground for extravagance. Sound thinking is rare in our times, and common sense is the least common of the senses. Many psychological difficulties originate in the effort to live in harmony with some immature system of opinions. Everyone has opinions, and for their holders, these notions are of vital importance, worthy of being passed on as an invaluable inheritance for their affairs. To disagree with someone's opinions is a serious social error that is not easily forgiven. But opinions are no more important than the mental achievements of the person who holds them, and opinions where ability is minimal are more abundant. Even your own opinions on any subject should not be taken so seriously by yourself unless know that you are fully informed on the subject. Movements of the point of mental attention. 3 basic attitudes: interest, indifference, and appreciation control the movements of the mental focus. Every human being has a sphere of personal interests. For most of us, these interests follow the lines of the familiar. The moment we move away from the familiar, we realize our mistake, and this realization, which outrages the ego, stimulates fear and doubt. This explains the human tendency to aversion, to oppose, and to condemn what is new or different. The patterns of the family home, and the doctrines and attitudes instilled there, the public school, with its emphasis on certain cultural and economic standards, the university, with its specialized curricula for various professions, the church, with its established dogma and tradition, and finally, the occupation chosen as a means of livelihood. All of these contribute to the frame of reference of familiar things and direct interests. Experience, resulting from the application of formulas to facts, completes the pattern and provides the final perspective. As an attitude, indifference is a lack of interest, which in turn is a lack of awareness. What lies beyond our experience is beyond our understanding. Our attention either passes over the unknown without pause, or selects only familiar elements that would otherwise hold no interest. There's an old saying that a shoemaker sees every man's feet, while a tailor sees only his hats and ties. Appreciation is a generalized awareness of certain subjects beyond the sphere of specialized attention. A person can enjoy music without technical knowledge and can respect achievements in fields very different from their own. The impulse to appreciate is highly constructive and is an indication of intellectual refinement. In most people, the center of mental awareness shifts with the day's interests and moods. There is little intensity of action, and even less continuity of purpose. Things they look at are not remembered, experiences add little to the sum of their knowledge, and opportunities go unrecognized. The inability to control the wanderings of the point of attention is a form of illness, just as the inability to control bodily functions is. People who lack inner organization cannot be healthy, and most of them suffer from nervous disorders that testify to inconsistencies in their habits and thoughts. Few Westerners realize that it is possible to control the mind or the emotions. They assume that it is necessary to obey every urge and fulfill every whim simply because they feel like it. The opposite extreme is the one-track mind. In this case, consciousness is dominated by a fixation that imposes arbitrary limitations on perceptions. The one-track mind has certain advantages from a financial and intellectual standpoint, and many of our successful industrialists and scientists suffer from this affliction. However, when we think about success, we must remember that it is quite possible to achieve admirable success in the economic world and fail completely in our personal lives. And this personal failure is what ultimately destroys us. The destructiveness of worry. Worry, which is intellectualized fear, is one of the most common destructive mental habits. Worry and the common cold are equally difficult to cure. The chronic worrier is always imagining the worst and suffers in proportion to the magnitude of the harm they anticipate. There is no universal remedy for worry, no simple formula by which the mind can free itself from its anxiety complex. It is useless to tell a person not to worry, and it is pointless to solve their problem. They will simply shift their attention to some other worry and continue in the same anxiety pattern. The story of the man who was deeply worried because there was nothing to worry about is not an exaggeration. Economic factors contribute greatly to the lives of the average person. The uncertainties that afflict us all are particularly difficult for the anxious individual. Many feel they haven't accepted their share of common misfortune unless they worry about public and private matters. An elderly woman once told me, "But I don't want to give up my worries. I would feel terrible without something to worry about." Worry causes inner suffering, and suffering makes us feel important, like the martyrs of old. It is difficult to fully estimate the damage that the habit of worrying does to the physical body. Vitality decreases, bodily functions diminish, and even the organic structure can be seriously affected. An individual's survival in reasonable health and their ability to lead a useful and happy life depend on a constructive mental attitude, and to achieve this, they must overcome the tendency toward excessive worry. Religion and philosophy are more helpful than psychology. In treating this, the individual must develop a perspective on life in which faith in good is stronger than fear of evil. Demoralizing remorse. Remorse is another demoralizing state of mind, in which one's consciousness focuses on past regrets to the detriment of present efforts. It's curious, but true, that those who have committed serious crimes are not always the most remorseful. Fixation can take a minor mistake and dwell on it until it becomes an obsession. If, in reality, a person has been guilty of a serious offense, the only way to balance their life's books is to compensate for the crime with kind and noble deeds. I knew of a woman who was so remorseful about a love affair in her youth, in which she had been responsible for the tragedy, that she made 2 husbands she had afterward miserable for years with her complaints and whispers. Everyone makes mistakes, but if they accept their lessons and grow from the experience, these same mistakes can ultimately do them good. Selfishness and egotism. No study of mental illness would be complete without a few words on the subject of selfishness. Here, a distinction can be made that is not clearly indicated in the dictionary. I would define the selfishness as self-awareness, and the egotismo as excessive self-consciousness. The ego is the them recognized as distinct from other selves, and selfishness is the natural result of this understanding. Psychologically speaking, the acceptance of the concept of the separate self leads to the impulse to protect or preserve individual existence. This brings into play the much abused libido, which is not necessarily sexual nature, but is better defined as primitive will to live. The quality of selfishness is present in most human actions and is responsible for most of our progress, both personal and collective. It is why we are, why we can do, what we can have, what we can achieve, yes, even why we can renounce, sacrifice, and die. It is said that no one can give more than themselves. It is selfishness that makes this supreme generosity possible. We exist. Religion teaches us to exist morally, philosophy to exist ethically, and science to exist efficiently. With the sense of self comes the solemn determination to protect the dignity of our being. Plato permitted suicide for those who could no longer protect the honorable state of their inner principles. The Eastern philosopher has no problem with the concept of the ego because he does not believe in the personality complex. For him, all subjective life is universal, and the greatest human achievement is overcoming the illusion of separate existence. It seems, therefore, that selfishness is the burden of the West, the peculiar responsibility of the West. Certainly, self-awareness is the root of our entire theory of life, manifested most fully in our competitive economic system. Herein lies the cause of strong individualism and the sincere but sometimes unpleasant belief that people must, generation after generation, strive desperately to excel in wealth, position, or achievement. A moderate amount of selfishness is necessary in the life of the average person to guard against the usurpation of other ambitious individuals. But there is very little to indicate that self-centeredness contributes to happiness or good health. In our time, personal ambition has become a dangerous disease in itself, and, by aggravating other ailments, it contributes greatly to bodily illness. Most successful men are sick. Selfishness, unless tempered by wisdom, gradually transforms into egotism, which is an obsession with oneself. Conscience becomes self-centered, resulting in offensive arrogance. This condition can develop further, producing a kind of mania, as is evident in the lives of tyrants, despots, and dictators. The deity complex is the final stage of egoism, causing the illusion of divine power and authority to arise in a personality ill-suited for a godlike career. Most of the world's conquerors who have drenched the earth in the blood of their fellow human beings have suffered from the deity complex. Pride, arrogance, the desire to possess, the will to dominate, the need to impress others with our superiority, and sacrificing the well-being of those around us for our own interests are common and often justified forms of selfishness. Society tends to reward those who think highly of themselves and penalize the modest. But the evidence remains that selfishness is a destructive mindset, and each person must decide for themselves whether to do what is best for their happiness and security, or to suffer by compromising their standards to conform to the folly of the world. There are other forms of selfishness that manifest themselves through a variety of negative attitudes: constant self-censorship, exaggerated humility, overly obvious modesty, certain types of caution and timidity, radical deviations from convention, and public denigration of one's own abilities are all evidence of self-consciousness. The normal person is one who is not self-conscious, and therefore has no need to exalt or condemn themselves or their actions. Considerable attention has been given to this problem because it plays a very important role in the health of both men and women. Wherever the focus of consciousness is, there will be stress and tension, and these forces are very detrimental to normal functioning. When the focus of attention is on the self, the individual cannot be natural and cannot relax. Life becomes a frantic struggle to satisfy the ambitions of the ego or to justify mistakes. This happens frequently, and even more so in the lives of selfish people. The man who never changes his mind, because changing it would mean admitting he was wrong, will surely have problems with both his temper and his digestion. And he's no better off than the bewildered mortal who told me he didn't dare acknowledge his mistakes for fear of losing faith in himself. The egoist always pretends to be more than he is, which creates an uncomfortable situation for everyone connected to his life. The tension caused by egocentrism can prevent the achievement of goals that are very important to the egocentric person. An old Chinese proverb states that the man who works for glory never does his work well. It is the man who works for the joy of working who, in the fullness of time, achieves well-deserved fame. When this happens, he is hated by those who have done little for themselves, the egoists who resent the greatness of others. Egoists are rarely content. They disrupt their body's chemistry with ill temper, and bitterness is their reward on earth. The divinity complex. Some metaphysical groups have contributed to the ever-present problem of egotism with teachings that could be interpreted as justifications for arrogance. It may be true that every person is a potential god, but if they dwell excessively on this potential without truly developing it, they are precisely on the path to developing a deity complex. I know of cases of people who seriously believed they were God, and who, because of this delusion, ruined their lives. Some have told me about long conversations they had with the deity, and how he appointed them to correct the world's ills. Others think they are great initiates, possessed by celestial wisdom acquired through degrees purchased from fraudulent organizations, or by having greatly overestimated certain psychic experiences they had and failed to understand. Still others possess esoteric secrets that would change the entire course of civilization, secrets that their masters had revealed to them. Possessing such astonishing knowledge, these people become so inflated with their own importance that their egos expand to the point of exploding. I have observed some of these cases for many years, and none of these poor, deluded men and women had made even the slightest contribution to human progress. Most religious organizations look down on the beliefs of other groups and sometimes develop elaborate explanations to maintain their prejudices. Each cult assumes its own infinite superiority, and this attitude is passed on to its members as justification for their spiritual aristocracy complex. As a result, devotees look with pity upon the unfortunate mortals who lack the revelation to join the self-appointed. Thus, the old fallacies of orthodox sects continue to affect metaphysically minded people, and under various names, holier-than-thousands sects flourish extremely in our time. While most mystical movements aspire to universal brotherhood, many contribute to racial prejudice. Arianism is a common phenomenon among so-called advanced souls. In these times especially, such a belief poses a threat to the survival of civilization, as the security of all humanity depends on the development of honest and constructive interracial and international perspectives. When a man has done nothing of which he can be reasonably proud, he is likely to turn to family, nation, or race for things that will inflate his ego. While it may be comforting to have distinguished ancestors or to belong to a dominant race, personal superiority cannot be inherited or conferred indirectly. Confucius defined the superior man not as one born into high status or of the dominant class or race, but as someone who, under any circumstances, would be incapable of performing any inferior action. Unfortunately, very little can be done to help the chronic egotist, because they refuse to admit any wrongdoing in themselves or their ideas. They always blame their numerous misfortunes on other people and other causes, and often adopt the attitude that everyone is to blame for their unhappiness. Only the laws of karma and reincarnation can resolve their problem, and it may take many lifetimes of pain and sorrow to break their ego complex. If the tendency toward an inflated ego appears in young children, it must be broken immediately, before it has a chance to take root. Spoiled children, or those from proud and wealthy homes, are the most likely to become offensive. The need for indications. The men and women of today who seek help for their personality problems are far more honest and cooperative than those of 20 years ago. Now it is the psychologist himself who may be faulty. He is quite likely to have his own academic fixations and endless prejudices. I know of cases where patients, who come to a leading professional to lighten their souls, have listened for hours to the psychoanalyst's harrowing tribulations and have even paid a considerable fee for this privilege. Several patients have told me that their psychoanalysis would have been far more helpful if the psychologist had been more idealistic and philosophical in his recommendations. Most people suffering from personality and character defects are profoundly ignorant of the simple truths of a constructive life. They have lost their impersonal perspective, and their problems are magnified completely out of proportion to their true worth. They are confused, disillusioned, and discouraged. They fear the world because it has hurt them, and they fear themselves because of the inner weaknesses that have caused them past and present misfortunes. For these confused individuals, a few simple guidelines are far more practical than profound, difficult to understand psychological formulas. For them, I would like to offer the following summary of basic truths that apply to health and happiness. 10 Commandments for Righteous Living. 1. You won't worry, because by doing so you will suffer the same disaster many times. 2. You shall not try to dominate or possess others, since it is the right of each person to govern their own actions. 3. You shall not desire fame, for the burdens of greatness are an affliction to the spirit. 4. You shall not desire great wealth, for there is no peace in the life of the rich. 5. You will relax, because great tension is an abomination to the flesh. 6. You will have a sense of humor, or your years on earth will seem much longer and more painful. 7. You will love what is beautiful and serve what is good, because this is in accordance with the will of heaven. 8. You shall not harm any person by word, thought, or deed, regardless of the cause, for to do so is to perpetuate the sorrows of the human race. 9. You will not be angry with any person for any reason, because anger hurts the person who is angry the most. 10. Never blame others for your misfortune, because each person's destiny is under their own responsibility. Chapter 9: Psychological and Pseudo-Psychological Illnesses. Treatments and Case Histories. Misinterpretation and Misuse of Knowledge, Popular Metaphysics, and Self-Kali Psychologists, Indigestive Thoughts and Ideas. Psychic phenomena are mostly psychological: the persecution complex, the case of the scarab ring, the case of the devil's weather vane malevolence. Returning pseudo-psychic phenomena: the case of the ghost boyfriend, the case of the Gettysburg ghost voices from the big afterwards, the case of the Widing Fingers delusions of reincarnation. Treatments and Case Histories. All proper names used in the case histories are fictitious, and any resemblance to living or deceased persons is purely coincidental. In ancient times, the secret sciences of nature and the esoteric aspects of religion and philosophy were carefully guarded by orders of initiated priests in the temples of the gods. A young man determined to dedicate his life to the service of the mysteries first had to obtain letters of recommendation from the elders of his town and the teachers of his preparatory school. These credentials attested to his outstanding character and academic ability. They were issued only after a thorough investigation of his family background and his conduct since childhood. The aspirant also had to demonstrate proficiency in at least 3 arts or sciences, usually mathematics, astronomy, and music. When a candidate for admission to the temple presented his letters of recommendation to the priests, he was further examined regarding his physical perfection, moral integrity, and devotion to learning. If he passed these tests with sufficiently high honors, he was admitted to the class of neophytes to begin his period of formal instruction. The period of study and evaluation lasted from 5 to 10 years, according to the rules of the order. At any time during this period, the neophyte could be rejected if he lacked the required aptitudes. At the end of his novitiate, the disciple was expected to undertake the Great Tour. Unless wars made the journey impossible, he would visit the mysterious temples in various districts and countries, studying for a time in each of the sanctuaries. Finally, at the discretion of the hierophant of his temple, the neophyte would be informed that he could attempt initiation. The initiation ceremony was divided into several parts. Selected priests interrogated the candidate to test his knowledge in each branch of the sacred sciences. He was then handed over to another group of initiators who tested his strength and moral and physical courage in trials that exposed him to a series of real and imagined dangers. If he failed any of these tests, the neophyte disappeared forever from the sight of men. The final part was a magnificent religious procession, held in the Grand Theatre of the Mysteries. The candidate was accepted into the Brotherhood of the Twice-Born, embraced by the master of the house, who also bestowed upon him his new name and the insignia of the order. The newly initiated was instructed in the final secrets of the adytum, and exhorted to leave this inner sanctuary and dedicate his life to the service of humanity. Misinterpretation and misuse of knowledge. These elaborate precautions were not imposed by any selfish desire on the part of the priests to prevent the spread of wisdom. They were dictated by 2 important considerations. The first was to prevent the ignorant from misinterpreting knowledge. The second was to prevent the unworthy from misusing knowledge. "The mysteries of God are for the initiated," sang the ancient Hebrew prophet, "and never have truer words been spoken." Many years of study, devotion, and self-discipline are required to prepare one's life and mind for the abstractions of metaphysical philosophy. it is a popular modern presumption to claim that knowledge belongs to whoever can discover it, by any means, whether right or wrong. The initiated priests of the ancient rites held a different conviction. They taught that knowledge belongs only to those who can use it wisely. The most difficult of all the arts and sciences is religion, because it deals with the intangible. Few are truly the points of reference among familiar things that can guide and direct the seeker of truth. Their reliance must depend on the strength of their own vision and the basic integrity of their own perspective, to protect them from the dangers of abstract contemplation. The ancient temples have vanished from the Western world. The priests who guarded the sanctuaries have disappeared, and the secret doctrines of old have become the religious fads of modern times. And now, after a lapse of centuries, the thoughtful observer is beginning to understand why the ancient priests refused to give their spiritual secrets to the uncultured world. Westerners find it difficult to maintain their spiritual values. There is little in their environment or experience that can help them. They have been educated in material matters, but are as ignorant as a newborn baby when it comes to supraphysical issues. But in Asian countries, mysticism remains a living force, and the more educated Easterners have a practical knowledge of the so-called esoteric sciences. We Westerners are not only ill-informed but blissfully unaware of our lack of information. The average person has no frame of reference by which to evaluate doctrines and beliefs. Popular metaphysics and self-cali psychologists. Those years of false prosperity between 1920 and 1929 were the golden age of popular metaphysics. Self-styled psychologists explained to the delighted public how dollars floated up looking for pockets to fall into, and that the secret of success was to stick your chest out firmly against the back of your shirt's third button. Metaphysical teachers in pastel-colored robes taught the spontaneous precipitation of prosperity and guided their enthusiastic followers in meditation, visualization, materialization, thought celebration, and power attainment. Orientals in turbans, disguised as yogis, enveloped their disciples in hopeless confusion, and when things got out of hand, they moved on to other pastures. This was indeed the heyday of cults, and the inmates of the madhouse, Bethlehem Hospital, were no more addicted to wild notions than those that later occupied the minds of serious New Thought students. Strange cults, large and small, sprang up like mushrooms in the night. There was no rule or reason in the various teachings. All claimed to be inspired, and each contradicted the others. A thoroughly uninformed public picked the best they could from the wide array of offerings. No one knew enough to justify their own choice, or to help others in their dilemma. They were all sailing together into the unknown on Sebastian Brandt's legendary ship of fools. Those were the days when housewives were deeply immersed in spiritual alchemy, and spinsters made solemn declarations after 2 weeks of studying astrology. The local tailor was a high-ranking Rosicrucian, and the neighborhood shopkeeper a Gnostic illuminist. There were meetings of elderly aspiring yogis at the home of a prominent hardware salesman, and the corner pharmacist practiced mystical Buddhist mantras for toothaches. All meant well, and each was desperately trying to improve themselves, but none knew what they were doing, nor did they have the slightest understanding of the dangers to which they were exposing themselves. The very condition that the ancient initiates feared came to plague America with all its deadly force. Humanity makes adorable mistakes sometimes, and this was one of them. The truth-seekers of those days were sincere and committed, but they couldn't succeed. They lacked wisdom and understanding. How could Mrs. Smith, who made excellent quince preserves, realize that it wasn't possible to master the secrets of Kabbalah in 10 simple correspondence lessons? She had never heard of Kabbalah until she took those lessons, and she didn't know that the wisest of Hebrew scholars approached the great mystery of Kabbalistic splendors trembling and fearful, and devoted their entire lives to prayer, meditation, and study of a few verses from their holy books. Many sects were founded during those troubled years of 1920. Some were created by honest and well-intentioned people, but without any preparation for dealing with the consequences and complications that always arise in man-made institutions. Most of these sects were short-lived and were destroyed by their own internal disputes. Other groups were created by completely dishonest men who had no interest beyond enriching themselves through the faith and credulity of their followers. These false leaders were definitely criminals, and the damage they caused to the lives of human beings is beyond measure. The Great Depression put an end to most minor cults, but some have survived to perpetuate confusion. For years, it has been one of my jobs to safeguard people from the consequences of false religious teachings. Only someone in my position, closely connected to the entire field of metaphysics, can have a clear idea of the suffering, disease, and madness left in the wake of fraudulent or deluded religious teachers. And these pernicious practices continue, protected by the right to religious freedom. Every few months, a new cult seems to emerge to further complicate the already painful course of human life. Indigestive thoughts and ideas. Occult-related illnesses are a direct result of inadequate or misunderstood instruction. This fundamental difficulty is further compounded by the unstable mental state that causes metaphysicians to wander from one belief to another, accumulating a mass of unrelated notions. Just as indigestible food produces physical stomach problems, indigestible thoughts and ideas cause mental dyspepsia. Once the mind loses touch with those simple certainties that protect the normal person, the power of direct, practical thought is lost, and the entire mental state degenerates into aimless wandering. When an ordinary human being has chosen a numerological name to improve their vibrations, modified their diet several times to increase their spiritual satisfaction, changed jobs to one that does not conflict with their current ideals, separated from their home because it interfered with their ascetic aspirations, painted stars on the ceiling of their meditation room to make the cosmos seem closer, practiced all the development exercises recommended by a variety of instructors, and periodically burned their books by rejected authors, they are on a direct path to becoming completely demoralized. Although the average cult is entirely indifferent to the well-being of its members, it is fully aware of their regular dues. To prevent members from straying, the cult may issue a series of calculated pronouncements to deter such transgressions. Such warnings are reminiscent of the worst pronouncements of the old Orthodox theologians. The repeat offender will, of course, lose all participation in heavenly bliss and earthly happiness. But this is only the beginning of their misfortunes. Black magicians will harass them for the rest of their days, evil spirits will plague their dreams, and malevolent forces will steal their possessions. Even the soul of the metaphysical heretic will be threatened with various calamities. One group warned that leaving their order was to delay oneself by 200 incarnations of spiritual evolution. Another sect warned that only members of good standing would be able to witness the second coming of Christ. Some leaders have gone so far as to suggest in general terms that they will use occult powers to destroy all followers who attempt to leave their holy ministrations. In this way, the old fear of the devil and his henchmen resurfaces in modern mystical movements. And most metaphysicians are also filled with panic, primitive fears with a thin layer of new thinking. In most cults today, belief in the miraculous has eliminated common sense. Trivial circumstances take on profound esoteric significance. Some people have called me in the middle of the night to report a strange scratching sound under the floorboards near their beds. Is this noise caused by a Mahatma? Or is it possible that an initiation is pending? Or is it the elementals again? Then, with a trembling voice, comes the inevitable question: is this some evil force coming to destroy me? If you assure the terrified person that a mouse under the floorboards would explain the situation quite well, and if they then accept your explanation, which is rare, their relief is mixed with disappointment. The victim had hoped the sound at least indicated the presence of a deceased relative. Psychic phenomena are mostly psychological. In the books on spiritual healing that have caught my attention, a clear line isn't drawn between psychic and psychological phenomena. It's common to assume that seemingly metaphysical ailments are, in fact, metaphysical, and treatment is based on this type of diagnosis. Experience shows that genuine occult phenomena are extremely rare, and physical suffering due to such causes is equally rare. Obsession, spirit possession, black magic, psychic persecution, vampirism, harmful occult influence, malevolent magnetism, troublesome spirits, and destructive vibrations are the most common forms of occult ailments. We can admit that such phenomena exist. Since history supports such beliefs, tradition further reinforces them, and experience confirms the testimonies. But we can also recognize that not even 1 in 500 cited cases actually involve supraphysical factors. Imagination, distorted by erroneous religious teaching, is responsible for a wide variety of curious manifestations that seem supernatural to the individual who has lost their sense of values. It is very likely that the person reading this demonology from Sinistrari until late into the night, he dreamed of demons and saw little devils watching him from the railing of his bed. After a few weeks of studying the Kundalini, and with the spiritual fire in the spine, the novice is almost certain to feel strange currents moving through their body, and imagine they are on the verge of cosmic consciousness. Soon after learning of the existence of masters and adepts, it should not be surprising if the burdened student dreams of these great ones, and then proudly announces that they have left their body and gone to a temple in the Himalayas. The imagination is always ready to supply the substance for things that are hoped for and longed for. The psychic phenomena reported everywhere cannot be genuine. Students are neither advanced nor informed enough to have such experiences. Clairvoyance doesn't come to one unannounced or without preparation, nor are people initiated into the secret orders of distant Tibet just like that. Yet many have asked me for explanations of their marvelous spiritual adventures in outer space. It never occurs to these people that something must be wrong when an initiate isn't told the meaning or purpose of their initiation, and furthermore, lacks the knowledge to explain the rituals they have undergone. The simplest method for diagnosing and treating metaphysical or pseudo-metaphysical ailments is by reference to case histories. These allow the reader to examine the evidence for themselves and discover how easily the human mind falls prey to mystical hallucinations. All these records are authentic, but names and minor details have been slightly altered to protect the patients from embarrassment. To successfully deal with problems of this kind, a physician needs a broad general knowledge of their field and 3 specialized skills. First, they must be a good listener, never easily shocked by revelations, capable of evaluating evidence, and, as a professional consultant, not susceptible to the misinterpretations the patient has come to believe. Second, they must possess a knack for strategy, so that the patient does not leave indignant or angry when the less than romantic basis of their case is revealed. Third, and invaluable, is a knack for amateur detective work, for it is often necessary to recognize revealing clues hidden beneath a mountain of false evidence. The persecution complex. In the field of religious psychology, the largest group of patients consists of those who sincerely believe they are victims of occult malpractice. For some reason, usually not entirely clear, these unfortunate individuals have incurred the wrath of black magicians, disembodied spirits, or people who are capable, in one way or another, of persecuting, intimidating, or victimizing them. In such cases, in fact, it is rare that those affected by all this evil power and attention can give a reasonable explanation of how they deserved so much evil. There is always a weak link in the evidence presented to support the persecution complex. One patient recounted at length how he had been attacked by evil forces while in a state of amnesia, with terrible consequences that lasted for years. The story was convincing, except for one point: the poor man couldn't remember when the amnesia had occurred. Another sad old man believed that several black magicians had invented a kind of radio that emitted destructive vibrations. He was certain that the entire force of this machine was directed at him because he could hear the devices buzzing day and night. It took a world of arguments to persuade this deluded person that what afflicted him was the buzzing of nothing worse than a common cold. The case of the beetle ring. One afternoon, Mrs. Mary Annette placed a large ornate ring with a lapis lazuli scarab on my office desk. She sat down, laid her hands on the papers on my desk, and exclaimed in a state of great agitation, "Can you help me get rid of this cursed thing?" Slowly, and with great difficulty, she told me her sad story. Mary had been studying the occult for several years with various teachers and groups. She had finally found her true master, a perfectly wonderful teacher who claimed to be the only living initiate of the Karnak mysteries. So Mary immersed herself completely in pseudo-Egyptian metaphysics. Then, one day, several months earlier, this good lady had been drawn by some psychic force to a small second-hand shop, and there was an old ring with a perfectly wonderful Egyptian scarab. It only cost her a few coins, because it was meant for her, and the shopkeeper had no idea of its value. She had only worn the ring for a few days, when she discovered that the scarab had perfectly wonderful vibrations. Now, it turns out that Mrs. Annette had a friend and fellow student who was a perfectly wonderful psychometrist, and one afternoon the two believers set to work with the ring. After the appropriate procedure, the fortune teller said that the scarab had belonged to an ancient Egyptian priestess who had been buried alive in the vaults of a temple because she had dared to oppose the will of an evil magician. He even said it was possible that her friend Mary was a reincarnation of the unfortunate priestess. It was all perfectly wonderful, but not for long. A few nights later, Mary Annette had a vision. The evil Egyptian sorcerer appeared to her in the darkness of the night, and her ordeal took on melodramatic proportions. The deceased sorcerer laughed diabolically, pointed his ghostly finger at the terrified Mrs. Annette, and told her that the ring was cursed, and that as long as she possessed it, her soul belonged to him for his wicked purposes. Then, to complete the fatal picture, he also threatened that if she ever tried to get rid of the scarab, he would destroy her, body and soul. The vision returned night after night, and all sorts of minor misfortunes began to befall her because of the curse. Her dog had mysteriously died. Then a family purse disappeared. One of her sisters had an accident, and shortly afterward, Mrs. Annette fell ill, the victim of a strange spell. She had gone to her teacher, the still perfectly wonderful master of Karnak, only to be told that the situation was very serious, because Egyptian curses defied the highest magic of the modern world. Long before the story ended with all its gruesome details, certain things were clear. There wasn't a single genuine psychic phenomenon involved anywhere in the events. The ring wasn't cursed. There had never been a priestess. The evil magician was an illusion. The psychometrist friend had run wild with imagination. The reported misfortunes were ordinary events, falsely incorporated into the story, and, last but not least, the perfectly wonderful master of Karnak was either a fraud, or he had uncovered the truth through some marvelous occult power. Fortunately, the evidence was conclusive, and Mrs. Annette went home happy. She no longer had any problems with ghosts, but she went through a very dramatic moment when she went to tell the man from Karnak what she thought. The only sensible person involved proved to be the second-hand dealer, who had a knack for spotting amateurs. A first glance at the ring revealed that the scarab was fake, one of thousands manufactured in Italy over the past 25 years. These counterfeit copies are sold worldwide as genuine, but at a price far below the value of truly rare Egyptian rings. Inquiring about what she had paid for the scarab confirmed that the good lady's strong vibrations could only have been in her own mind. What had actually happened to Marionette was this. She had Egypt on her mind, but not the Egypt of the archaeologist or antiquarian, but a fantastical, imaginary Egypt, one that existed only in the mind of a charlatan metaphysical teacher. This unworthy man controlled his ignorant followers with perfectly marvelous revelations, which he orchestrated to serve his purposes. Unsettled by these splendid fictions, Mrs. Annette was drawn to the ring, not by its vibrations but by her exaggerated interest. The incompetent psychometrist provided what was necessary to induce a particular hallucination. When Mrs. Annette dreamed the story she had heard, she mistook her dream for a vision. The more she thought about the dream, the more she believed it, and the more she believed it, the more certain it was that it would be repeated. The other complications followed as a natural consequence. There are accounts of Egyptian curses that have never been satisfactorily explained, but fortunately, this was not one of those strange cases. The cause of Marionette's months of fear and acute mental suffering was nothing more than fraudulent instruction in mystical beliefs. The case of the devil's weather vane. The weary Mrs. Sarah Briswell was searching the world for a Whistler painting of her mother. Her story was especially distressing to me, because of the great sorrow and misery that had been brought to the final years of a sweet and gentle life, which had already been burdensome enough without this additional pain. It took several hours to hear her story, but in essence, it is as follows. Mrs. Briswell was nearing 80, her husband having died 15 years earlier. After his death, she had turned to metaphysics for solace and comfort. She attended many classes and studied with nearly every teacher who had visited her community. One professor in particular had made a profound impression on him. This wonder man was part of the self-styled first line of defense against the dark forces bent on destroying humanity. All cults, except his own, were allied with the devil, and even heads of state and nations were, in reality, black magicians determined to overthrow the world. The air was thick with malevolent vibrations, and a great dark monster hovered like an immense bat above the earth. This hideous creature lay in wait to devour anyone who rejected the salvation offered by the Wonder Man in 10 simple lessons of an advanced course for the chosen few. Terrified by this horrific global situation, the small old woman Sarah Briswell lived for years in constant fear. As a child, her already weakened mental faculties developed into incurable phobias. She dared not leave her room in the boarding house where she lived after nightfall, for fear that some malevolent force would harm her. She recited magic formulas every night to protect her immortal soul, and hung sacred images on the walls to ward off dark magicians. Then it happened. How terrible! From her small window on the 3rd floor, Sarah Briswell could look down over the rooftops of the run-down neighborhood where she lived. About 100 yards away stood an old mansion, adorned with decorations from the 1890s. On one corner of this ostentatious house was a round tower, and atop it was an elaborate wrought-iron weather vane. Sarah Briswell was fascinated by the weather vane. One day, as she gazed at the artifact, to her astonishment, the arrow slowly turned and pointed directly at her. Then, as the small woman put it, it all came crashing down on me. The old mansion was the headquarters of the dark forces trying to destroy the world. The evil sorcerers cast their terrible magic through the weather vane. Sometimes they aimed its arrow at her, and she could feel the terrible vibrations trying to kill her, for she was part of a terrible secret. It was useless to explain that the wind had turned the weather vane's arrow. That kind of explanation is only good for uninitiated mortals, who don't realize that dark forces are plotting humanity's extinction. Nor did it help to point out that the house with the weather vane wasn't an ogre's castle, but a cheap hotel where impoverished elderly people rocked all day on the wooden porch, because Mrs. Sarah Briswell knew that the old folks had been hired to sit there so no one would suspect the sinister beings who gathered in the dome. There wasn't much that could be done for Sarah Briswell. She was very old. Her mind was too weak to grasp the truth about her own case. But she found some psychological relief simply in telling her story. She had the personal comfort of feeling that she had done her duty, for she had taken on the task of saving the threatened world. Trusting that the matter would be given due consideration, Mrs. Briswell left with a better attitude, and a slight feeling of how pathetic she had been. She would discreetly move to another house, where the forces of evil could not find her. This is the only case of psychic persecution involving a weather vane in my records, but there are numerous cases where fear of malevolent beings has caused years of mental suffering. Unfortunately, this condition will continue as long as fraudulent religious teachers, some of them mentally unstable, are allowed, in the name of religious tolerance, to circulate false and destructive doctrines among their susceptible followers. The malevolence that returns. Among mental prosperity cults, the persecution complex arises from a type of fear in which the mental selfishness we harbor toward others can, in turn, be directed against us. Once, a man who was holding the thought for a wealthy relative to die and leave him a fortune suddenly became certain that the rich uncle was sending equally harmful mental vibrations toward his wicked nephew. Here, a guilty conscience reaped its own reward. Education is no protection against complexes once the intellect weakens. Two unmarried sisters, both with university degrees, developed a psychic enmity rooted in a culture of religious neurosis. One of them made a demonic doll to represent her sister, and performed the ancient magical procedure of sticking pins into the doll. The victim, fully aware of the plot, suffered terribly until she discovered a protective counterspell that rendered the effigy harmless. Ignorance offers no protection either. A doctor in Santa Fe told me this curious case. One of his patients, a completely uneducated Mexican man, was cursed by a witch. They told him he would die within a year from that day. The cursed man's health slowly deteriorated, though he had no physical illness, and on the appointed day, he lay down in his bed and died of fright. This man believed his life could have been saved if a Mexican boy named Jose had put his clothes on inside out and then ordered the witch to release her victim. That's how primitive psychology works. Pseudo-psychic phenomena. Imagination conspiring with the subconscious mind can simulate many kinds of psychic phenomena. Sometimes the deception is so perfect that with a few weeks of patient investigation, the facts can be uncovered. There is no conscious intention to deceive, but there is usually considerable illusion involved in the events. Many people turn to the psychic realm in times of grief. Under such conditions, reasoning faculties have little opportunity to function. So intense is humanity's general desire to communicate with a deceased loved one that, particularly in times of mourning, people attribute supernatural origins to even the most trivial events. Once inside the mystical labyrinth of the psyche, it is truly difficult to distinguish fact from fantasy, especially when we want to believe in that fantasy. This chapter should not be interpreted as an attack on spiritualism. The reality of spiritualist phenomena is firmly established by tradition and experience. The qualified researcher, approaching the subject with a trained mind, can and does make important discoveries about that other life so close to our own. But the sentimentalist, seeking only solace or peace in an emotional turmoil, easily falls victim to their own delusions. Some of my case histories should be of real value to researchers in the field of psychic phenomena. The case of the ghost boyfriend. Mrs. Betty Larson and Mr. John had been married for a year. She was an attractive young woman. a graduate of a well-known university, sensible and practical in every way. Betty had become interested in the occult through her mother, who was deeply involved in a cult specializing in soulmates. This was the only part of the teachings that made a significant impression on the young woman. John was an average 25-year-old American, simple, hard-working, very much in love, and a bit boring. He wasn't interested in mystical things. If Betty had those ideas, that was fine with him. Mrs. Larson explained her daughter's problem clearly and simply. She wasn't passionately in love with John, but she sincerely admired him and felt they could be happy together. They had been married for about 3 months when their lives had been triangulated by a visitor from the other world. The apparition had appeared to Betty at midnight, and she was certain, as they always are, that she wasn't asleep at the time. He was a handsome young spectre, dressed in clothing from the romantic medieval period. In a spirit voice, he told the young wife that she was his soulmate, and that she was married to him forever in the inner world, that she should divorce her husband and remain faithful to her spirit companion for all of life, and that they would be united forever after her death. "I don't know what to do," Mrs. Larson told me. "John is a good man, and all this has hurt him terribly. But my soulmate is everything I've ever dreamed of, and if it's destined that we're one, I must be faithful to him." For a moment it seemed this might be a real psychological problem, but Betty revealed the key to the whole thing when she said her mysterious visitor was everything she had dreamed. Because that's exactly what it was, a dream. Like many other young women, Betty, in her teens, had created a romantic ideal in her mind of the man she would one day marry. Of course, such a dream rarely comes true, and in her conscious mind Betty knew this. She married John as someone who promised to be a satisfactory husband, even though he possessed very few of the attributes of her ideal type. But her subconscious mind remembered Prince Charming, and a half-hearted belief in the soulmate doctrine was enough to set in motion the mechanism that generated the young wife's vision. Imaginations of this kind cannot bear to be exposed to the light, and Mrs. Larson only had to realize that her soulmate was the personification of her childhood dream hero to see the whole process through. There were no more visits. The case was closed. John, a thoughtful young man, learned from the experience. He immediately cultivated some of the qualities his wife particularly admired, and this contributed greatly to the couple's happiness. Betty made a perceptive observation as she left my office that first day. Could it be said that almost all soulmates have had the same origin as mine? The Gettysburg ghost case. Old Captain Hartzell departed this mortal sphere in 1930 from complications of physical illness, but before he died, we had many conversations about the ghost that ruined his life. It is a case where it is quite possible that the problem began with a genuine psychic experience, but gradually developed into a typical psychological delusion. The night after the Battle of Gettysburg, the captain, exhausted and slightly wounded, lay down beneath a small tree and fell into a deep, trance-like sleep. Just before dawn, he was awakened by someone shaking him roughly. Sitting up, half-dazed, the astonished officer saw a tall, gleaming white figure among the tree's branches. The supernatural being spoke in a low, mournful voice. "I died, and I did not want to die. Yesterday I died on the field of Gettysburg, and now from the spirit world I can see the senselessness of war. Wars must cease, so that no more innocents die as I have. Wait, watch and pray, for in the fullness of time I will reveal to you the secret of eternal peace among the nations of the earth. Through you all wars will end." After these prophetic words, the apparition vanished. Perhaps it was the vision of a soldier who had died in battle, or perhaps it was the ingrained aversion to war in the captain's subconscious mind that caused the vision. The truth will never be known. But one thing is certain: the ghostly encounter ruined Captain Hartzell's life. Year after year he waited, watched and prayed, and the spirit appeared to him many times in dreams, always promising that it would soon reveal to him the secret of world peace. On several occasions the revelation seemed near, but for some reason, at the last moment, it was always delayed, again and again, year after year. For nearly 70 years, the captain faithfully awaited the spirit's message with the solution, but it never came. He never married, he gave up his business and eked out a living doing odd jobs, knowing he could leave those the moment he received the great call. Throughout his life, he consulted numerous mediums and psychics, but they could not wrest the secret from the mysterious spirit. In the end, Captain Hartzell died at the soldier's home, a heartbroken old man who now rests in the army cemetery with the others who had fought at Gettysburg. Promises of world-changing revelation from the spirits of the dead are a common and tragic form of psychic disturbance. I know of at least 100 such cases personally, and not one has received the promised knowledge. The first vision he had at Gettysburg may have been genuine, but even so, the specter of the dead soldier held no real solution to the tragedy that had destroyed him. He appeared only once. It was the captain's fixation that conjured a phantom from the stuff of his longing, hope and belief. This imaginary spirit could not give him the secret of peace, for he could know no more than the mind in which he was created. This is the true explanation for most pseudo-psychic phenomena. If the supposed entity exists only in the mind of the believer, it can in no way solve problems that the believer cannot solve. Such promises from pseudo-spirits, therefore, are either not fulfilled, or the answers come from the same level of thought as the living person. Thus, immature opinions can be transferred to the false phantom to be returned to its original creator through a vision, as if it were a divine and astonishing revelation. In this way, many cults have been founded by self-deceived people, and then they blame the spiritual world for fantastical and unfounded doctrines. Voices from the great afterlife, being haunted by voices supposedly belonging to the spirits of the dead or to black magicians, is a common form of pseudo-psychic disorder. From my large collection of case stories, I've selected one. It concerns a prosaic man, a plumber by trade, who tried to develop his spiritual perceptions using a crystal ball. William Jetty began hearing voices after his third crystal session. At first, he was thrilled with his newfound clairaudience, but after a while, the spirits annoyed him with their constant chatter. The voices seemed to come from thin air, and from the differences in their tones, they appeared to be male and female. At least a dozen distinct spirit personalities could be identified. The plumber was distraught when he came to see me. He had no peace, day or night. His surroundings were filled with whispers, laughter, moans, and shouts from various entities. Some of the voices were vile and hateful, others gentle and pleading. Recently, the voices had urged him to commit suicide, howling with a macabre laugh and telling him he was going insane. Even as he told me this story, Jetty could hear the demonic laughter of the spirits. It took considerable time and much analysis to clarify the case of William Jetty, the plumber. The spirits that tormented him had been born in the ghostly realm of his own subconscious, in a horrific procession of impulses, phobias, and complexes that had assumed auditory forms, to unleash their sorrowful energies through the symbolism of words. Jetty heard the voices in his mind, and it was in vocal patterns that all his old hatreds, fears, greeds, desires, grudges, and disappointments whispered their confused stories into his mental ear. Repressed impulses can, of course, manifest as voices, and in this case, a secret impulse towards suicide took this means of expression. It was a great help to William Jetty to learn that his problem wasn't caused by evil spirits. As he put it, "I can fight my own faults, but I can't fight the supernatural." Half the battle had been won when the true state of affairs became clear. The unknown assumed monstrous proportions and paralyzed his initiative. He once again closed the door to his subconscious and, at the same time, returned the ghosts to their proper place. Jetty set to work on some of his major fixations himself and cleared them up after a while. William Jetty gave up the crystal ball. He now knows that sitting for hours staring into a glowing sphere with a blank mind is more likely to unleash ghosts from the subconscious than to raise genuine spirits from the deep fog. The case of the moving fingers. The woman was about 40 when she came to my office. She was mentally, emotionally, and physically disorganized. Her suffering stemmed from a severe overdose of popular cultism. There were several interesting points in her narrative. Mrs. Ethel Kirkbride, as we shall call her, had been married for 15 years and was the mother of 3 children. From obvious character flaws, it was readily understood that she was a poor housewife, mentally lazy, full of self-pity, addicted to countless worries, extravagant, and complaining. A few months ago, Mrs. Kirkbride had noticed a peculiar twitch in her right arm and hand. This increased until she became completely automatic. Now, all she had to do was pick up a pencil, and her fingers would begin to tremble as if moved by some spiritual force, and the result was scribbled, half-legible material, signed by an archangel. The purpose of the lady's visit was not to seek help for her condition, but to invite me to publish her spiritual manuscript and thus change the course of human history. Analysis of the book revealed it to be a mass of horrible, desperate, and unrelated jargon, utterly worthless to anyone. It contained everything from flights of fancy to bad poetry, all steeped in bitterness and frustration. The manuscript was embellished with a number of curious examples of neurotic and erotic symbolism. By breaking down the book using the Freudian technique, generally applied to dreams, the automatic writings had very clear indications that Mrs. Kirkbride was unhappily married and had some rather unpleasant notions about her husband. When I told her that her automatic writing was a complete exposition of her private life, Ethel Kirkbride was outraged. As it was demonstrated to her, incident by incident, she frowned and bristled. Finally, when she could no longer bear the evidence, she grabbed the manuscript, tore it to pieces, and stormed off with a string of unrefined remarks. But some good things came out of that scene. Mrs. Kirkbride never wrote automatically again. But it's doubtful that her home was any happier. I have observed on several occasions that automatic writing can originate in the subconscious mind. It can arise as a way to fulfill desires, or as a means of releasing frustrations and inhibitions. The same is true of the Ouija board and other psychic instruments. Delusions of reincarnation. The doctrine of reincarnation is one of the noblest and most practical philosophical teachings. For some years now, it has been fashionable among metaphysicians to recall 3 or 4 past lives. They refer to these previous appearances as my 7th return or my 9th life before this one. And if their memory is a little weak on this subject, imagination always comes to the rescue. Western misunderstanding of the great law of rebirth as given by Gautama Buddha led to many humorous and pathetic situations in the age of modern mystics, bringing the topic to the forefront of their attention. A little gentleman unexpectedly entered my sanctuary one day and approached me, and solemnly announced, "Here I am." Clearly, my reaction wasn't intense enough, so he added, gesturing wildly, "I am Ramses the Great, reborn to rule the world." This visitor wasn't crazy. It wasn't his mind that was lost, but his common sense. A funny incident occurred at a meeting of an occult organization when a leader declared that she was the reincarnation of Hypatia. Instantly, another prominent member stood up and shouted, "That's not true. I am Hypatia." A tall, thin man with a smile accentuated by the absence of 3 front teeth once approached me after a lecture. "It's a secret," he whispered. But I am Jacob Baimi reincarnated. It seemed like an excellent opportunity to obtain valuable information about the strange teachings of this German mystic. But the toothless man couldn't answer any of my questions. He explained that he had completely lost his previous knowledge, saying, "I am here for a greater purpose, and all my previous knowledge has been blocked from my consciousness. It's more complicated when the memory of other lives is so complete that the person remembers their past incarnations as well as the present one." A charming character enthusiastically grabbed both my hands, exclaiming excitedly, "Can you imagine meeting you again after all these lives? Isn't it wonderful? And to think we used to teach together in Atlantis." Then I met a Native American who could tell by the moons in my eyes that we had been blood brothers in Lemuria. The adepts on Mount Shasta had suggested to this Native American that. He asked me to lend him $10, and that lending it to him is what a blood brother would do in such circumstances. We all have our vanity, and the kind lady who recognized me as the original model for one of the Easter Island statues will never realize the scar she left on my ego. There isn't much variety in stories about reincarnation. The elements are generally similar with only minor variations. Sometimes, past lives can generate phobias and aversions. One man attributed his pyrophobia, fear of fire, to his belief that he had been burned at the stake in a previous existence. A woman of dubious morals excused her nymphomania by claiming to be the reincarnation of Sappho, and without a trace of lyric poetry. Two case histories will illustrate the common tendency toward the belief in reincarnation. The first is undoubtedly false, and the second is probably true. Both individuals were convinced that they had lived in Rome during the early centuries of the Christian era. Robert Forsland was certain that he was the reincarnation of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, emperor and eclectic philosopher. While at university, Robert had developed a bad case of hero worship of this Roman nobleman, and had chosen meditations as the subject of his thesis. After several years of experience in the insurance business, Forsland read a book on reincarnation and began to speculate about his own past lives. Quickly his mind turned to Marcus Aurelius. Could the haughty Marcus be reborn in the body of a humble insurance broker? If it were possible, it might be probable. If it was probable, it might be so. And so it was. After this extraordinary example of logic, Robert developed a firm conviction that the greatness of Rome resided in him. For a man of mediocre achievements, an imperial destiny was a great responsibility. Robert did his best, but he was woefully inadequate. Trying to be a Superman, he utterly failed at the task of being an ordinary human being. He lost the respect of his friends, and his insurance employers decided not to promote someone with such an obsession. If Robert had borne the slightest intellectual resemblance to the splendid Marcus Aurelius, he would have been forgiven everything. But from any point of view except his own, such a statement was absurd, and can only be interpreted as a mental aberration. Albert Moorhead was a completely different kind of man, and his story demanded serious consideration. When Albert was 6 years old, he told his parents that he had lived before he was born to them, and that in his previous life, he had been a Roman soldier stationed in Palestine during the reign of Emperor Vespasian. The Moorheads, a devout Scottish and Irish Orthodox family, were horrified. All the relatives tried in many ways to refute this strange memory. But the boy could not be convinced, and added so many accurate details of Roman life and history that in the end his parents were only half convinced. The boy told them that in his previous life he had been called Lucian, and that after serving several years in the Near East, he had returned to Rome via Ephesus. Because of his service in foreign wars, he became a member of the Imperial Guard and frequently accompanied the emperor on state missions. Later, he retired and went to live on a small farm, where he died at an advanced age. At 11, Albert insisted on studying Latin, and he learned the language so quickly that by 13 he could read Virgil in the original. As he grew older, he was only interested in a military career and joined the army. Some time after enlisting, he left the service. Life in the army during peacetime was not exciting. Years later, Albert Moorhead read about the Buddhist doctrine of reincarnation. He accepted it immediately because he knew from his own experience that it was true. He rarely spoke about his memories, but one afternoon he summarized his conclusions thus: "I was just a soldier from 18 centuries ago, living the life of my time. I hope that in this incarnation I can do something truly worthwhile. But if I cannot accomplish everything now, I will do the best I can, and look forward with certainty to other lives. In the end, I will make my contribution to the good of humanity,